Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Eric Lupfer. I'm Executive Director of Humanities Texas. It's wonderful to have so many friends here this evening. I'd like to welcome you to this special event on behalf of Humanities Texas and the Texas Book Festival. This is the first time that we, the State Humanities Council, have formally partnered with the Book Festival on a public program. So I'll begin by thanking Lois Kim, the director of TBF, and her team for the partnership and for their work throughout the state. The missions of our two organizations overlap and complement each other in really meaningful ways. Tonight, we are delighted to host a discussion between Mike Gillette and Julia Sweig about Julia's new book, Lady Bird Johnson, Hiding in Plain Sight. I'm just sorry that we're not all together in person at the Byrne-Reed House holding this program. Before I begin formal introductions, just a few logistical notes. So on with the show, and I'll ask Mike and Julia to turn on their cameras. So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Mike Gillette and Julia Sweig. Mike, as all of you know, I think, was Executive Director of Humanities Texas from 2003 to 2019. His former positions include directing the LBJ Library's Oral History Program from 1976 to 1991, and serving as Director of the Center for Legislative Archives from 1991 to 2003. His most recent book, Lady Bird Johnson, An Oral History, was released by Oxford University Press in 2012. Julia Sweig is an award-winning author of books on Cuba, Latin America, and American foreign policy. She's currently a senior research fellow at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. And as you know, the focus of our program this evening is Julia's new book, Lady Bird Johnson, Hiding in Plain Sight, which is a remarkable and deeply researched portrait of Mrs. Johnson, and which reveals her profound influence upon her husband's political career and presidency. But the book also documents Mrs. Johnson's own considerable policy initiatives and their impact on the lives of Americans. So Mike and Julia, thank you very much for being with us here tonight. And Mike, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Eric. It's a pleasure to be here and to have a discussion on this very impressive new biography of Lady Bird Johnson. I want to begin, Julia, by asking you about your subject matter here. You've written outstanding books on Cuba and Latin America. What led you to do a biography of Lady Bird Johnson?
Well, thanks, Mike and Eric and your team. I'm really delighted to be here with all of you tonight. That is a wonderful question and very worthy to kick us off, because it doesn't really quite make sense why somebody who had worked in foreign policy for so many years would then pivot. The answer is pretty straightforward, though, and that is, in working in foreign policy and traveling around Latin America and working not just in diplomatic history, but writing about and as a practitioner of policy issues, I was often the only woman in the room. And I live right outside of Washington, D.C. My affiliation with the LBJ School is as a non-resident, just to clarify. I'm speaking to you from just outside of Washington, D.C. And spending all that time as one of the few women in the room and giving a lot of thought to how women navigate power, especially in this town in Washington, I decided that I wanted to try to zoom out a little bit and give some thought to that matter of women in power, but I didn't have a subject. And I was a woman in search of a subject when a friend told me, you should maybe take a look at Lady Bird Johnson, because she kept this diary when she was in the White House. And I am an archives geek first and foremost. My first book was based on material in Fidel Castro's presidential archive. And the idea that there was a body of material that was almost entirely unexcavated about a woman so closely associated with the president, identified so much with that word power, that just brought it all together for me. And when I first started reading her material and all of the secondary literature, and then listening to her audio diaries, that just hooked me. So the pivot was complete because of her incredible public service that she left with all of this material, and the fact, and this is the last point, that her story really had not shown up, I thought, in the way it deserves to, in the way the story of the Johnson presidency had been told.
Now, 90% of this diary was not published, was unpublished, and I guess was not even transcribed, or at least a good deal of it. You're the first author to have gotten into this wealth of material. Tell us what that experience was like.
Well, it's 123 hours of audio tape, 1,750,000 words of transcription. I don't know how many pages, but first of all, it's completely an overwhelming amount of material. But Lady Bird's training as a historian and as a journalist really helped a lot, because she was so elegant with her use of words. She was so cogent in how she strung them together into sentences and then in paragraphs. And then, of course, the stories she was telling I found to be totally riveting. I mean, she recounts 3 political assassinations, some of the most consequential legislation in our country's history, plus the Vietnam War, and she's that woman in the room. So it was incredibly daunting to try to get my arms around the material, but my attention was riveted. And then I think what was the most difficult about it, Mike, was that the diary entries are not the only piece of this story. I mean, there are many, much more archival material that I had to then weave into the story and to flesh out her description of her experience, to check it again. You know, often I was sitting with his daily diary, her daily diary, trying to wed them together and show who was doing what when, or taking a look at developing chronologies of events that were taking place in the very same day, one on Washington, one in Selma, one on Vietnam, one on civil rights, with those 2 people at the center of it. So it was a very challenging to the brain and organizationally also.
I love the way you framed this challenge. You said that Lady Bird and LBJ were meticulous curators of their legacy.
Yes.
Why don't you talk about that and what this legacy documentary legacy consisted of?
Well,
love letters when they were courting.
The love letters from the beginning in the 1930s. Mike, you know this, of course, better than anybody, but the sheer volume of material that the 2 of them kept records of. And I'll just speak from Lady Bird, for example. You know, she kept these small little spiral notebooks with her all the time, and she took notes on their entire political enterprise every time she had the opportunity to. I don't think those things have been even processed by the library, and they're in shorthand. So in a way, I was spared that. But between, you know, the commissioning of the oral histories, as you note, and as you participated in so actively, hers, and also those of so many hundreds of other people, the tapes, let's say LBJ's tapes and the other LBJ's tapes, right? They were both ahead of their time. I mean, one was secret, the other wasn't secret, but they, I think, understood at some level that there was no way that in real time their story would be adequately captured, that the tumult of the moment, the disaster of Vietnam, their kind of metacognition of how that would overshadow what they were doing domestically from very early days after they came into the White House, all of it contributed to this huge ambition and appetite to make sure as much of it was documented as possible, so that historians in the future could try to get some clarity about everything that had gone on and to put things in context.
Well, and both President and Mrs. Johnson were very proactive in getting other people to place their papers
Yes.
in the library. And Mrs. Johnson certainly opened a lot of doors for me with oral history interviews that I would not have gotten if she hadn't put in the request. So.
And one of the things I was surprised about was to learn from her own accounting how early in their tenure in the White House they started thinking about and planning for the library and sending out requests for people to start donating material. I mean, in 1965, she travels around to look at different ways that libraries are organized and to identify the best possible architect that might one day design the library. She says, I think, she meets regularly by 67, 68 in the treaty room. She called it her boardroom with her team to work on the library. And she writes at one point in her diary, well, we're putting out this call for people to contribute, and we're saying that we're going to try to open the library in 1969. I hope that's not too much of a clue that we're planning on leaving or something along those lines. That's before March 68 when he announces that they're leaving. So this was a part of their strategy to document the legacy and build the Taj Mahal, not the Taj Mahal, to build their institution right from the get-go.
Right. Well, and he wanted the papers open too. That was really his
Yes,
call.
he did.
And she was terrific in following through on that after he died to make sure that you've written in your book that Lady Bird Johnson redefined the role of First Lady. How did she do that?
Well, I think of Lady Bird as the bridge between Eleanor Roosevelt and Hillary Clinton. She's the person who, with Liz Carpenter, and as you correctly point out, Bess Abel, along with LBJ, knit together a joint political operation between the East Wing and the West Wing. And I focused in the book a great deal more on Liz Carpenter in terms of her having the standing with both LBJs to really tell it straight and to do the kind of brokering with the guys in the West Wing that was necessary often to get them to see the political value of the women in the East Wing and the fact that this was a joint political operation. She, of course, also in Liz and those that Liz hired had a professional communications strategy led by Liz. She was herself an expert communicator, and she had a policy staff, most especially with, and this is a part of the modernization, in addition to the social staff, she had a policy staff, I'm thinking here now on the environment, of Sharon Francis, who was her tasked to go to the White House from the Secretary of Interior's office, Stuart Udall's office, and became her go-to person on navigating the federal and the local bureaucracies, outreach with the environmental philanthropists, outreach with community organizations in Anacostia, writing her speeches, helping her get her arms intellectually and philosophically around where she wanted to take her environmental agenda. And she did that all, of course, with not much of a budget, but with the kind of standing and stature that, because of her partnership with LBJ, she was able to show to the public because of the nature of their private understanding in terms of how important she was, and his recognition of how much she could deliver politically to his policy agenda.
Your book also points out the extent to which she brought in a lot of talent from the outside to just advise for people like Barbara Ward and Jane Jacobs and Lawrence Halpern. Talk about some of those people and the influence that they had on her in shaping her knowledge and her views of the environment.
Well, the three that you mentioned, I'll start with Barbara Ward. I think she's kind of a surprise too. She's a British economist who had been very close with Adlai Stevenson and taught at Harvard with John Galbraith, and was a Kennedy person too, and sort of one of these individuals who hopped back and forth across the pond pretty frequently. And she was doing some serious thinking about what came to be understood as megacities, but about the urban crisis and about sort of the issues, the interrelated issues of inequality, industrialization, development, and use of resources and depletion of resources in America, in cities globally and in American cities. And Barbara Ward started to come to lunch with the Johnsons very often in the first year, year and a half that they were in the White House. And she had a great influence on both of them in the way they thought about the Great Society and in the way they thought about the role of government in leveling and leveling up the social playing field and the economic opportunity and what government could do along those lines. In American cities, Lady Bird's focus on the environment has a great deal to do with Barbara Ward's influence, or was, I think, shaped in part by Barbara Ward's comprehensive vision. The second person in terms of American cities that influenced Lady Bird, who came to the White House for one of the early doers luncheons, was Jane Jacobs. And Jane Jacobs, of course, was the woman in New York City who was fighting these big, large projects that Bob Moses had been building and threatening to build all over the city. And Jane Jacobs comes to the White House and she kind of thinks, you know, I'm going to set these ladies who are just interested in tulips, I'm going to set them straight. But what she found was actually far more interest and open-mindedness from Lady Bird and the other women in the room about this idea that, and this comes on the heels of big urban renewal projects that had gone sort of sideways and had been very devastating to local communities in the 40s and 50s, that spending lots of federal money to do something which we all thought at the time, or was thought at the time, as modern and progressive, wasn't necessarily modern or progressive in its consequences for the most underserved communities that were affected by these urban renewal projects. Jane Jacobs, I think, she and Lady Bird were in sync intellectually, even if the influence wasn't a straight line. And then, of course, there's Lawrence Halpern. We can come back to him, but I know you have so many questions. But Halpern was an extremely influential and important partner with Lady Bird in the work she did in Washington, D.C.
Right. She seemed to always want to learn. She had a hunger, a thirst for learning throughout her life. It was, she never thought that she knew everything. Your subtitle, Hiding in Plain Sight. Tell us about that subtitle.
Well, that has two connotations. The first is, and I'm speaking to a group of people, many of you knew Lady Bird Johnson, or certainly had a closer and more long-standing understanding of her and her role perhaps than I did. But I think there is a common misconception about Lady Bird, which is that she's sort of a two-dimensional character, very controlled, stand by your man, sort of conventional first lady, who planted flowers, who was into highway beautification, and that was really nice. But we also kind of had lacked an idea of her full substance. And the hiding in plain sight is that, in fact, there was this very substantive, very smart, very influential woman staring at us right there in the White House, but we just failed to see it. And that goes to the second point of the second implication of the title, which is that the source material that allowed me to tell this story was also sitting in the archives for a good long time and largely passed over. And I'm not just talking about the audio tapes and their transcripts. I'm talking about a huge body of material that's sitting in the LBJ library and at other archives around the country, for example, in Stuart Udall's archives or in the Rockefeller archives and the Library of Congress. Much of that material not incorporated into the telling of the story of the LBJ presidency. So the source material itself also hiding in plain sight.
Wonderful, yeah. You've got a terrific chapter on how Mrs. Johnson served as a surrogate for Jacqueline Kennedy during the 1960 campaign when Mrs. Kennedy was not in a condition to campaign around the country.
Well, they had a relationship that predated the 1960 campaign. Of course, when LBJ was majority leader and his seniority conferred to Lady Bird in terms of the world of Senate spouses, she was very gracious and brought Jackie in. And, it wasn't the Washington political scene wasn't as much Jackie's scene as it was Lady Bird's. And yet Lady Bird really was fond of her, and almost 20 years in age difference. But by 1960, of course, the power dynamic shifted, with now the Kennedys on the top of the ticket and these far more senior Johnsons coming in as vice president. And as you say, Jackie was battling miscarriages and she was pregnant, and she didn't want to be flying all over the country on the rope lines. But this was Lady Bird's thing. She knew how to do it, and she made herself totally indispensable. She was game, and she flew. I never remember the numbers, but it might have been over 100,000 miles during that campaign, all over the country, often with Jackie's sisters-in-law and mother-in-law. And of course, we know that Jackie loved her for that. And Bobby Kennedy credited her with winning Texas in 1960 for JFK. And then, of course, when we get to 1963, there's a couple years where Lady Bird has, as second lady, stepped in a million different ways for Jackie. And so by the time they get to 1963, they have an intimate, kind of poignant understanding of one another. And together, I found to have orchestrated a really exquisite and difficult transition in the 14 days between the time of the assassination and when the Jackie and her kids moved out and the Johnsons moved into the White House.
One footnote from that 60 campaign was the mink coat mob that Mrs. Johnson and LBJ encountered on their walk to the Adolphus Hotel in Dallas. And of course, it was a terrifying moment because they were being jostled and hit with things and yelled at and spat on. And Mrs. Johnson suddenly realized that LBJ was going a lot slower through the crowd than he needed to. He was milking every moment for the television cameras to take full advantage of that. And that's what brought Richard Russell into the campaign for the Democratic side, that offensive moment in Dallas. So, but her campaigning had really been confined to Texas until that surrogate role that she had in 1960, and must have given her a much better feel for the nation as a whole.
Well, she talked about that, and I think she loved it too. And then when she became second lady and she started to travel internationally, even though LBJ was a bit miserable as vice president, she talked, I think, with you about just what a wonderful time she had and the imbalance between the two of them, he and his misery and she having a gas.
She loved to travel. That was her great moment to do that as a vice president's wife. Yeah. Wonderful. You wrote that by the time the Johnsons reached the White House, LBJ's reliance on her for emotional stability was almost total. Tell us about that, the role that she played there in terms of just shoring him up.
Well, by the time they reached the White House, they'd been married for close to 30 years. So I think any of us who have been in a multi-decade marriage or partnership of any kind understand that the mutual dependence is pretty strong once you get to going on 3 decades. In LBJ's case, of course, he had a volatile personality, and he had something which maybe we would describe as depression and anxiety, and a kind of battle between incredible ambition and insecurity, and awareness of his limitations and energy to exceed his capacities. And that when you're a public figure, of course, the you're tested all the time. And trying to keep hold of one's center required by him a great deal of Lady Bird Johnson. And that's especially the case after his heart attack in 1955. And then especially even more the case once they lose Walter Jenkins. And Lady Bird really, to my mind, becomes the president's most important advisor and confidant of everybody compared to anybody else. That's my take on it.
Well, in that telephone conversation between the two of them when he was in New York and she was in Washington, and she made it clear that she was going to come out and say words of support for Jenkins, that she was going to go public with that. And she handled that so beautifully in a very difficult situation.
Well,
Yeah.
her humanity was very much on display at that moment in terms of Jenkins and his family, but also her political judgment and how astute she was about what was the best way to neutralize this as a problem. Not as Abe Fortas and Clark Clifford were advising LBJ to quash the story and kind of, marginalize Walter Jenkins, persona non grata him, PNG him practically, but actually to embrace his humanity, to offer him a job, to make the exit easy. Not only her humanity toward him, her political strategy, but her awareness of LBJ. And when I listen to that conversation, sometimes I think she invented the Johnson treatment, because you hear in her this kind of combination of strategy and arm twisting and gentle manipulation. I mean, she's done all of her homework. She's identified exactly how to bring her prime constituent to align his interests with hers. And she moves him along, and almost as if it's a fait accompli before they even get on the phone. It's very Johnsonian. And it shows you, of course, not just her talent, but his trust in her, because by the end of the call, he's totally on board. And the statement that she releases is mirrored pretty closely by that which the White House then releases, with some important differences.
Oh, wonderful. One event that you wrote about that I really hadn't paid any attention to until I read your book, and that was Mrs. Johnson's commencement address at Radcliffe.
Yeah.
I thought this was a wonderful chapter. Tell us about that.
Well, in 1964, before LBJ had been properly elected in his own right, Mrs. Johnson hadn't really settled on beautification or the environmental focus of most of her tenure. That wasn't really solidified yet. And she spent some time, this was, of course, 1963 was when Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, was published. It's when the women's movement is really taking shape. Mrs. Johnson was a woman of a different era. She wasn't a strident feminist. She never would have called herself that, of course, but she had great respect for the idea that women and young girls who were becoming women could have it all. And she goes to, it's sort of Helen Gurley Brown 20 years before Helen Gurley Brown. She goes to Radcliffe to give a commencement speech, and this speech, in which Barbara Ward participates in drafting, for example, and a number of other people, a number of other interesting feminist writers at the time, really shocked me because it sounded so modern. It was really one of my first clues, Mike, that this was somebody who was far more complicated and nuanced than it appeared. She tells the graduating class, you have a responsibility to deepen your profession, to participate in civic life, to raise your family, to have a husband, to do it all. And you don't have to wear those low-heeled shoes and be strident about it, but go out and get it all. And if you're not going to have families, that's okay too. Some of you are just going to be incredibly successful professionals. That's 1964, and it's Lady Bird Johnson. And she then just a few months after that, leaves Radcliffe and goes to Detroit and gives a speech to the home economists, the National Conference of the Home Economists. And she, you know what she says to them? And by now the war on poverty legislation has passed. She says, I think you all ought to get out of the house. And I think that we ought to think about how when we're fighting the war on poverty, putting too much money into the pockets of men might be wrong. It's women who are going to be the economic motors that are going to make this economy fly and help families get out of poverty. And that was something that we heard Hillary Clinton talk about, 30 years later. So very much ahead of her time, very surprising stuff coming out of her in 1964 on women's issues, but totally missed because her delivery and sometimes the sophistication of almost the subterfuge of giving that kind of speech to the Association of Home Economists, one could almost understand how it would be missed. She wasn't going up she wasn't going to protest women's movements in the streets. She was doing it in the most conventional spaces and delivering a very progressive message.
One topic that she did not cover in her diary was the whistle stop tour through the South, 1964 October. Tell us about that and her experience on that train trip.
Well, she didn't have time while she was on the train. I mean, she found time to record those diary entries in the most unbelievable circumstances, but not while she was on a 4-day, 42-stop, 8-state train trip through the Deep South. That was too much even for her. So no, she didn't record any of her entries. But the Whistle Stop Tour, I'm sure many of you know about it, was her attempt after the Civil Rights Act was passed in July of '64 to campaign in the Deep South for her husband and to make the case for the New South to embrace the new Democratic Party and its embrace of civil rights. And she did this, and as the train went farther south, the environment became increasingly ominous. And where she encountered, for example, in Richmond, Virginia, some mild kinds of pushback, by the time she got to South Carolina and certainly the Alabama-Florida border where there were death threats, the resistance was very, very strong. But it was the first time that the wife of an American president campaigned in a presidential campaign season alone without her spouse. Eleanor Roosevelt had campaigned with independently for her on her own poverty and other issues, but not in a presidential campaign context. And Lady Bird said she didn't want to lose the South by default. Lyndon had sort of already, as we know, famously said to Bill Moyers after the Civil Rights Act passed, we've just lost the South for my generation and yours and beyond. But Lady Bird was of the South. She had spent her summers as a kid growing up in Alabama. She deeply understood the resistance they were going to encounter, but she also believed that there was an opportunity to bring some of her people along. And that's why she did it. They won 3 of the 8 states that she went to, meaning they lost most of the South.
3 counted, and it was a way for her to show that she still appreciated the South, the area that she was so familiar with, and spent summers in Alabama. And a lot of wonderful women went along on that trip. Lindy Boggs had a major role. And,
of course.
Talmadge, a lot of people, and they made the most of it. Now, beautification. She was never happy with the term beautification. But
no.
She couldn't think of a better one.
She couldn't think of a better one. She said, I'll never forgive Lyndon's boys for making me use that word. But I used it anyway, because I figured if I talk about wildflowers, because eventually if people cared about the wildflowers, they'd care about the land that grew them. Something like that. But beautification was a kind of euphemism for an evolution of her environmentalism that started maybe with the ornamental, but really came to be about something much more fundamental, which is how to bring democratic access to nature, meaning how to make it possible for people of all races and creeds and economic lots to have access to nature, especially in American cities. Of course, she did a great deal of work to promote national parks, but the beautification programs that I write about are also in Washington, D.C., especially, which she saw as a model, a potential model for the rest of the country. And DC, of course, was the Johnsons' home for 30 years, and it was the largest Black majority city in the country at the time, totally, almost entirely segregated, and wherein there was no political representation. There was no mayor, there was no city council, there was a South Carolina white supremacist who controlled the committee that controlled the budget. And Black Washington was totally underserved as regards swimming pools and parks and opportunities for recreation. And this was a woman, of course, who had grown up where, for whom solace in nature was essential to her having access to her own humanity. So she really was trying in Washington, D.C. with beautification, in addition to the beautiful blooms that we have, including today, to bring together civil rights and what we think of today as environmental justice, all within the context of the Great Society programs. But she didn't do a great job, I would say, of articulating that at the time. And I'm not sure if it was that she was so careful, such an astute political animal, that she wasn't ready to be so explicit, or if it was just that these were in fact disparate issues that it took some time to knit together.
I think it was probably the latter more than the former. You know, she and LBJ had some trips in which they focused on pollution, air and water pollution.
Yes.
But highway beautification was another emphasis that had come from her driving back and forth from Texas to Washington every year, and the beauty that she saw and the junkyards and billboards that she saw.
And I think that when she took on the billboard industry and the junkyard industry and the automobile industry and the highway industry, and trying to get them to self-regulate, which was obviously very difficult, that was a big political battle. You know, and the idea that a president's wife was going to go right into the heart of big financial interests is again kind of an answer to your question about how she modernized the office of the First Lady. She took on big interests in the name of something that sounded kind of benign, but was very significant.
I always think of the famous political cartoon with the billboard saying "Impeach Lady."
Impeach Lady Bird. Exactly. She got a kick out of that.
Yeah. Well, and some of her close lawyer friends in Texas were representing the billboard industry, so it was a difficult battle there. She and Interior Secretary Stuart Udall did a lot of traveling together. Tell us about some of those trips.
Well, the relationship with Stuart Udall, they did take many trips. They took trips to California. They took trips to New Mexico and to Wyoming. And some of them were campaign trips, and some of them were about inaugurating big public works projects and major new national parks, or national parks that weren't new, that needed to be given some love from senior people from the White House. But, you know, Udall in 1962, Udall had stayed on after JFK was assassinated. He was one of only two members of JFK's cabinet who stayed throughout the entire LBJ years. He had published in 1962 The Quiet Crisis, which was a sweeping history of the American environmental story. And he very early on had the clarity to see that Mrs. Johnson could be a very significant and important ally to him. Of course, she was married to the president, and Stu Udall, in the weeks and months between over the course of 1964, he was a prolific memo writer, and was he campaigning hard with the president to have the most expansive environmental agenda possible in terms of water and air and rivers. And he was close friends with Rachel Carson, of course, and their environmentalism together was part of the zeitgeist. So he came to the ranch in 1963, in 1964, November of 1964, right after LBJ's landslide election, and starts cultivating Mrs. Johnson. And she's at first a little skeptical about him. She's taken by him and the fact that he's Mormon, and that his grandparents were polygamists, she says, kind of with a laugh into the audio. But they develop a really important partnership. And it lasts for the entire duration of the LBJ presidency. It has an unfortunate ending, but he influences her tremendously, and she works with him to expand to work on the matter of building public consciousness around the environment, and there gives the East Wings as a platform to a number of very important environmentalists, philanthropists, landscape architects from all around the country over the course of her tenure there. And it's Udall's knowledge and Lady Bird's political standing that they really bring together on environmental matters, and also in Washington, D.C. especially.
Sure. Well, our timekeepers may tell us that we're ready to turn it over to
Wonderful
discussion. Is that right, Kelsey or Eric?
Yeah, this is a wonderful discussion. We have a couple of questions that have come in from the audience, and I'll share those. The first is from our friend Max Sherman. Max says that he once heard an interview with Mrs. Johnson, and she was asked her favorite international figure. And Max says, I was surprised by her answer, which was the Shah of Iran.
Shah of Iran.
And Max writes, my guess is that her answer was this because of his role for equal rights of women, but he'd like your thoughts on the matter.
He's correct. That is precisely the reason why. And it's not a story that's well known, is it? But of course, under the Shah in Iran, women had immense educational and professional opportunity. And I believe that Lady Bird had traveled there when she was second lady and had the opportunity to meet, I'm going to forget the honorific of the Shah's wife, what she was called and what her name was, but she was very impressed. And I believe Tehran is one of the places where she held, might correct me if I'm wrong, one of her first doers' luncheons when she was abroad, because it was actually when she was traveling abroad that she started saying to the embassy staffs, please don't just have me inaugurating hospitals and receiving and giving bouquets. I'd like to actually sit down and meet with the most interesting women in your country. And she did that because she wanted to give them a boost. But of course, as Mike says too, she was a sponge. She just wanted to learn absolutely everything she could about wherever she was. And I think she had a great experience around women's issues, and surprisingly so in Iran. Mike, is that accurate? Is it Iran that I'm thinking of?
And Mac Sherman's benefit, she told me the same thing one time. I was flabbergasted. That was the last name that I would have expected, but she had her reasons, and she certainly did admire him.
There's another story. I know we have other questions, but I'll tell you that there's a diary entry when the Shah and his wife come to Washington, and she brings them up to Lyndon's office, and she's giving them a tour of the private quarters, and she picks up and reads to them aloud some letters that he's received from boys that are in Vietnam. I think she felt that she could share that with them.
Interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. There's a question from Chase Untermeyer, and this is something that we've touched on a bit, but I think you might have further thoughts, Julia. Chase writes, the image that we have of Lady Bird is as demure and ladylike, and Lyndon as bellowing and coarse. How did she stand up to him? How did she or is that the right way to describe sort of their relationship?
Well, here I want to be very careful again, because the truism that we hear that you can't really get inside of anyone's marriage is certainly true. So, and I wasn't around them, obviously, but what I surmised was that two-dimensionality, both of her and of Lyndon, is just, a tiny part of the story. They were very intimate and close with one another, and that meant often, and I could see it in her material, giving one another a hard time about how they looked and their weight and their hair. And it wasn't just Lyndon who harassed her. She was in his face all the time about, did he put on too much weight, and is that the right hair for you, and anxious that he could lose weight as quickly as he could, and the dieting and the exercise and the health obsession. I mean, that's all through the diaries. And to be honest, it to me is a counterweight to that kind of two-dimensional image that you just suggested, which isn't to say that Lyndon's vulgarities and his philandering weren't awful. It's just a small part of what I think was the totality of a very layered and complicated and long-term personal and political enterprise.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question from Ellen Temple, who congratulates you, Julia, on the book.
Thank you.
Wonderful, and has enjoyed the discussion. And Ellen writes that Mrs. Johnson had a profound influence on me and many other conservationists in her focus on the importance of native plants in the environment. And so asks whether you've considered telling the story of the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center.
Oh, Ellen, I thank you for your comment, and I wish you could be here to tell the story of the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, because if you finished reading the book, you know that I didn't get to write the whole story of Lady Bird Johnson, which means that I can't give it the robust story that you'd like. But what impresses me about the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center is that it's about so much more than wildflowers and native plants. It's a center for education on climate change mitigation. It's an environmental education place. It's a beautiful place. It sort of brings together all of those pieces of Lady Bird, the wildflowers, the emphasis on native plants, and of course, the importance of native plants in terms of preserving the actual land that they're planted in and the particular environment where they come from. And the role of education in terms of keeping and building public consciousness around the environment. But Ellen, perhaps, if you could weigh in and tell more that I haven't included.
Well, yeah,
Okay, you can't do that, right? I apologize. All right.
I will just say that the Wildflower Center would not be what it is today if it had not been for Ellen Temple. She came in at a time when it was a very precarious financial situation, and she turned it into a huge success. Ellen, the fact that we're able to enjoy it today as we are is thanks not only to Mrs. Johnson and her family, but also to you and others who helped. Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you all. I would really like to see a book about the Wildflower Center, because I think Ms. Johnson was right on the cutting edge, and I wish that Julia would write it.
Oh. Okay, we'll talk.
Well, if we don't have any other questions from the audience, I'll pose one myself, Julia, maybe as just a way of sort of summing up. But we were talking briefly before the panel began this evening about your experience since the book has been published. And I'm wondering if you've learned anything new about Mrs. Johnson's legacy now, as you've spoken with so many people about your book.
Well, I was telling you and Mike and Kelsey and Melissa that yesterday I actually participated in my first live event that's related to this book rollout. And that was an incredible experience and a wonderful thing to celebrate. But because these interactions are webinar formats, I've actually unfortunately had, well, twofold. I've had wonderful audiences, but I haven't been able to see anybody. And therefore, it's been kind of not as interactive as I would like it to be, unfortunately, but maybe we're starting to turn a corner now. So the dialogue that I'd like to have had has been, unfortunately, a lot of Julia Sweig monologue.
Well, I certainly hope that you're right, that we're turning a corner, but I really do appreciate your time this evening, and thank you for joining us, and thank you for your book. And this really is a wonderful contribution to the kind of broad understanding of Mrs. Johnson's legacy. Mike, thank you tonight for serving as our distinguished interviewer. And finally, I just want to thank everyone here for joining us, for your support of the Texas Book Festival and for Humanities Texas. Any final words, Julia or Mike, before we sign off?
Well, my best to everyone that has signed on. I've seen the names. I don't know if you're all actually there, but it was great to see that you'd signed up, all of you that were so important to Humanities Texas throughout my tenure there, and continue to be helpful to Eric. It's great.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed the book, and I'm grateful to have had the chance to be with you tonight. And Mike, I don't know if you remembered that I came and sat with you when you were still at Texas Humanities Texas several years ago at the very beginning of the process of doing this book. And I'm really glad to be with you again tonight and to meet you, Eric.
Oh, what a treat. And I had no idea at the time it was going to turn out to be such a success.
Oh,
Congratulations.
well.
Really
Thank you. I hope you all enjoy the book. I'm delighted that you'll have the chance to have it.
Well, we so appreciate you both, and everyone, thank you for joining us this evening. Please keep in touch, and I think we all hope to see each other in person soon. So good night, everyone.
Amen.
Good night.